Hello, and welcome to Making It Up. So the concept here is simple. I sit down, have a great conversation with all sorts of different writers. We talk about why they do what they do, how they became the writers that they are, and at the end, we have a great time just making up a short story together. So today on the show is international and best-selling and award-winning author Alex Marwood, who is as compelling a conversationalist as she is a thriller writer. She's also just a genuine person, and from my observation and my interactions with her, just a selfless contributor to the writing community. So Alex has a long and varied history in writing. She spent many years as a journalist, all the while she was starting to write novels under a different name. And the first novel that she wrote under Alex Marwood was Wicked Girls, which you might know that title. It was shortlisted for the ITW, Anthony, and Macavity Awards. It was included in Stephen King's top 10 books of the year. Holy shit. And won the Edgar Award. So really amazing accomplishments. Her most recent release is The Poison Garden, which Booklist calls an extraordinary novel of psychological suspense. So we had a great talk. I got to meet her lovely cat. She talks about coming from a history of writers and her families, about writing career disasters, which is kind of the one constant. If you're a writer, you're going to have some pitfalls in your career for sure. And also she talked about what it's like being diagnosed in her 50s with ADHD and how that has affected her writing career. And at the end, we get to make up a nice little story. And this one was a little bit about poisoning. So it was really fun to talk to her. Stay tuned. This is me talking to Alex Marwood. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Sorry, I was a little bit late because the cat reminded me he needed feeding at 1 minute to 7, and we wouldn't have heard the last of it if I hadn't. He's an extremely vocal cat. So,
what kind of cat?
He is Burmese. He's a blue Burmese.
Okay.
He's an absolute tyrant, and I adore him. And he's definitely, I find that Burmese cats are quite essential to my sort of writing well-being. To be honest, I've always had one.
I have a Bengal cat.
Oh, fantastic!
And he's wonderful.
Is he bossy or
is he what?
Is he bossy? Is he?
Yes, he's a tremendous pain in the ass, and I have a whole list of notes that I give to myself before I record one of these, and the very first one is lock the cat up, because he would just be in my face screaming at me, hoping for attention the entire time.
Yeah. Well, I hope that Baloo, now that he's had his supper, he's got a best friend next door called Mr. Poochie. And it's a great love for all the ages between those two. And so hopefully they, once he's had his dinner, Mr. Poochie goes and will be sitting on the wall outside, waiting for Baloo to appear. And then they will go off and terrorize the local rodentia.
Well, listen, I'm so excited you're here, and it's nice to finally meet you.
It's great to meet you at last. Yes, exactly. It's really nice in the face, if not the flesh.
Yeah, and our relationship consisted of me reaching out to you, or a friend of ours reaching out to you to blurb one of my books, and that's always such a stressful thing, trying to get a blurb, and when people ask me, it is, isn't it?
Oh, it's skin crawlingly awful. It's just so awful. It's such a relief when somebody else does it for you. Actually, I think the worst feeling in the world is having to sort of go to people that you've had perfectly pleasant relationships with before, or indeed total strangers, and tell them they've got to read your book. It's ghastly.
and it's such a relief when somebody does.
Enormously, you obviously, yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And I've, tried to make a commitment to myself to blurb almost anyone who asks me, I do dedicate myself to read the entire book, and I really carve out time. So it is a big deal, but I've been given a lot of breaks by tremendous names. So
I think it's absolutely essential to, be a community person, if you see what I mean,
And then you grew up in the UK?
I grew up in the UK. My father is Scottish. My mother was London Irish, and my father was a professor at Oxford University. So we grew up in the countryside outside Oxford,
Oh,
basically.
what did
And
he
then
teach?
he taught military history.
Huh.
And one of my mother, but I mean, my mother is going to have, it's quite an arcane subject. My mother's going to have had some very interesting conversations with St. Peter, because she actually managed to marry 2 military historians in her life.
Wow, that must just be the common attraction. There's something
Yeah, there's
deeply
something
rooted in
great.
her
Yeah.
that's really attracted to
Well, my
military
father,
history.
meanwhile, married 2 women who were born on the 8th of August. So go figure that.
And did you have siblings?
I've got 2 older siblings, a brother and a sister.
Okay.
My brother's about 3 years older than me. My sister's 18 months. So we were all very close together.
And so you're growing up in Oxford, and did you start to develop a love of books, or where did that kind of interest
Yeah, I
first
mean,
start?
actually, I think it was partly, well, I mean, obviously, I came from a family that was very literary. Both of my grandmothers were successful novelists in their time.
Oh,
So it was taken completely for granted that writing books was something one did, if you see what I mean, as well as reading them, and everywhere was completely full of books. Everybody in the family read, and quite a lot of them wrote one way or another. But also, growing up in the country was very boring. I think that there's a lot about the country that I appreciate now that I didn't particularly
sure.
as a restless teenager, and so my great good fortune was that my parents didn't pay an awful lot of attention to what we were up to be honest. So I got myself an adult library card and just binged on books. We went into Oxford in the summer holidays once a week, and I would get down to the library and take another armful of usually quite violent and or sexy books out, and binge my way through those.
So there was no restriction on what you read. It didn't
No,
matter.
I don't think they even noticed, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah.
But again, actually, because I think because of my grandmothers, there was a lot less. I'm not quite sure how to put it. They were. I think there was a good deal less snobbery about what one should be reading.
What did they
Funnily
write?
enough, they wrote, well, one of my grandmothers wrote rather famous. Was rather famous. She was a woman called Margaret Kennedy, and her big book was one called The Constant Nymph, which
Okay.
was a literary novel 1920s. It's actually also the biggest bestseller, I think, of the 1920s. And the other one wrote romance. She wrote real, Mills and Boone throwaway, 1 a month romances.
Wow.
After her husband
That's
got sacked
fascinating.
from the army, that was how she kept her children at expensive schools.
So when was your first novel?
My first published novel. I finished my first novel, I think, when I was about 15, and obviously it was, yeah. Anyway, I broke my arm very badly one summer, so I was stuck indoors while everybody else was out swimming and riding horses. And so I wrote a book, and I also decided I was going to learn to type at that point. So I had a typewriter that I'd inherited from my uncle, and I taught myself to type, but I actually had the one arm in a cast and in a sling, so I still to this day basically type like this.
That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard.
So then, after I left university, I wanted to be a writer, but I have never been awfully good. We'll probably get onto this subject later. At sort of taking on board sort of things like plans and 5-year plans and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I just decided I was going to be a writer. When I
Well,
left
what did you
university.
study in university?
I studied English literature, and actually,
Okay.
funnily enough, my my tutor, when she interviewed me, who's a wonderful, wonderful woman called Gillian Carey, she said, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a writer. And she said, well, don't read English literature, then you'll lose your voice for 10 years. And actually, she was completely right. But anyway, I ignored her, and she let me in, and it was great, and I did. And but I think I was very, very lucky because she and the other teachers knew that I wanted to be a writer. They never made me read a single critic throughout the entire 3-year course. I just read great books.
Wow.
And then had to give, you know, it was the Oxford system where you basically, you do go to lectures and things, but you know, you have a 1 or 2 one-on-one tutorials every week, and you've got to produce an essay about what you've been reading, and justify yourself to these very clever people who ask you hard questions, you know.
Right.
So it was fantastic because I really did have to read. I read all the good books, but I also had to learn how to read them, actually keeping an eye on how they were doing, what they were doing, and you know,
Right.
working out how it was done. So I didn't get my thinking sort of mucked up by the opinions of other people, which was really nice.
So you leave university, you know you want to be a writer, you know you can't figure out a 5-year plan. So what does that mean?
So I basically started temping and writing in the evenings, and you know, and things, and then I picked up a part-time job proofreading the Oxford English Dictionary. And
what do you use? What do you use to proofread the dictionary with? Like, what are your tools?
A strange little magnifying glass it's quite difficult to describe. It's like a long narrow magnifying glass that's sort of domed on one side. Got you run it slowly down, comparing it against the old dictionary, you know.
So if you find what you think is a misspelling, you have to refer to another dictionary.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of thing, you know. Yeah, you have to go back to the old dictionary and see if they're, you know. Yeah, so it was you know, anyway, it was great because I learned, you know, my vocabulary expanded enormously, and it was good because it was part-time but well paid enough, and also I didn't have to go out and go anywhere. That I was able to also, you know, write. So that went on for a couple of years, and I wrote a couple of novels, which I totally understand why they didn't get published now.
What type of novels were they?
One was a sort of your classic first novel after you leave university. It was sort of about what it's like to be at university, you know. And then the second one was a sort of ghost story, and you know, it had points to it, but I completely understand it wasn't a finished product, really, you know.
So you shopped it, but nothing happened with it.
Yeah, well, actually, I did get an agent out of that, but she didn't manage to sell it in. But meanwhile, I went back to temping and ended up temping at the Independent newspaper, which at the time was the paper of record. It was quite newly launched and had been the most extraordinary success. Then got destroyed by banks a few years later, but you know, that's another story. But anyway, I went in and covered the secretary of the arts desk at the Independent, and suddenly found myself surrounded by my people. You know, it was just amazing. You know, just these hugely intelligent, hugely knowledgeable people with just, you know, mad arcane knowledge coming off the tops of their heads. We were all competing to make it look easy.
Yeah, and probably a lot of other struggling novelists in that group as well.
Yeah, well, actually, funnily enough, yeah, I mean, you know, I Sabine Durrant, who I don't think has done as well in the States as she deserves to, she was working at the arts desk then too, yeah, but funnily enough, the Independent had a sort of strange thing of whenever anybody did well with a book, they basically find an excuse to sack you as a journalist. So that eventually is what happened to me 10 years later.
Oh, but that's yeah, I mean, a mixed blessing, right? Because you had done well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I had to go and take writing books seriously as well, you know, so
Yeah.
you know, whatever. But anyway, that was absolutely, it was amazing. So anyway, so I'm in there and I'm, you know, typing up people's letters, and I discover um uh a casual subbing shifts, which I think really barely exist these days. But you know, they're basically sub editors. You know, they always need people for subs days off and things like that. So I stuck my hand up and said, can I do that please? And they gave me a try and it was fine. So then I started doing that, and then a job editing the crossword came up, so I took that. And again, that was a part-time job, and but meant that I was in the office all the time, and whenever I heard somebody say, well, who can we get to write that, I'd go, me. And after about 4 years, I was full-time as a journalist, writing features and columns basically. And
so
then, yeah,
during all this time, you know, it sounds like you enjoyed most of this work, but were you, yeah, and you certainly weren't naive about, I'm going to quit my job and become a full-time novelist.
yeah.
But was that always the goal?
No, that came later, darling.
Yeah. But was that always the goal? Why, or you were really
Yeah, it was always the goal, but it was just, I mean, it was absolutely amazing. I mean, I can't particularly I think if you're a bit shy, which I know I don't seem it, but I actually am, journalism is an incredibly good thing for a writer, because it forces you to go outside your comfort zone and go and, you know, not just talk to other people, but more importantly, make them talk to you.
Yeah.
You know, and
it's tremendous for research skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for writing at speed, and for also not being too precious about your work. You know, I think so many first time novelists get this terrible painful shock when somebody edits their work. And they can't believe that anybody would do something so cruel to them, whereas, you know, as a journalist, you know, you turn your stuff in and the next thing you hear of it, generally, unless there's some really major question, is seeing it in the paper the next day.
Yeah.
So, you know, you just learn to let go of your work and to trust editors, which is really fantastic. And actually, funny enough, my current editor in the UK says that she absolutely loves working with journalists because they're all like that.
Well, and so I come from that angle as well, for sure, because when I got my first agent, first of all, I couldn't believe anybody cared enough.
Yeah,
and they said yes. And then when you start getting editorial notes after you sell your book, I didn't come from a background of writing, so I was just so thankful. I'm like, oh yeah, you're totally making this book better. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and it's amazing because people have good ideas.
I feel, you know, yeah. It's exactly how I feel. But yeah, definitely, I've seen so many young, you know, first timers just in floods of tears because somebody has told them that they need to change something, you know, major in their book.
And it's not that everybody's always going to be right and everyone's going to have different opinions.
Absolutely.
But the other side of it all in the publishing industry is it's a business, and you are part of a team.
Absolutely.
And you have to be easy to work with. You could be a brilliant writer, but if you're not easy to deal with, no one's going to want to.
But if you strop off, then you are eventually going to, if your sales drop, they're going to be less keen to nurse you along until they pick back up again. To be honest, you know, you're much more likely to get dropped if you're not nice to work with. You know?
So isn't it funny that you seem to have a pretty clear understanding of how difficult it is to support oneself as a novelist in any age, and you were clear about that because you had all these other jobs, but yet that was still the full-time goal, and you achieved it. I mean, you look back on that, it's like, I can't believe. Well, eventually.
But there was with a great big hiccup in the middle. So what happened was, I was writing a column for the Independent. I was at that point writing 3 a week. So I was writing this anonymously because the features editor had rung up and said, can you think of some way that we can sex up the secretarial pages? You know, that's a professional phrase, as I'm sure you know. I said, well, actually, funnily enough, you know, I remember when I was temping, it was just fascinating watching the way that people behaved in offices. And so would it be fun to have an anonymous temp writing a sort of office anthropology thing? And you know, anytime you got bored with one set of people, you could just immediately lose that job and go on to the next one. So you know, just plenty of room and plenty of scope. So anyway, I was writing that, and it started getting fan mail, which, you know, this was back in the days when, you know, people communicated with newspapers on, you know, in green ink and paper, basically, you know. And you know, so fan mail is an extraordinarily rare thing to get. And it was fantastic getting that, you know. And I just thought, you know what, I bet I could fardle this up into a 20-something writes a passage novel about that awful shock when you leave university and find that you're not actually as brilliant as you thought you were. So I did that.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, well, and it worked really nicely, because I just basically dropped the columns in as sort of dividers between the chapters.
Yeah, you had all the material.
Yeah, and then made a plot and a bunch of characters, and off I went and wrote it. And I wrote it incredibly fast. You know, I mean, obviously adrenaline. There's nothing like the overexcitement of finally getting a book deal, is there? You know.
Yeah.
So I wrote that in 5 months while still working full time. It did really, really well. It you know, it went to number 3 on its first week. It never got to number 1 because Bridget was the era of Bridget Jones's Diary, so there wasn't a chance, you know. So it was Bridget Jones 1 and 2, and then The Temp was at number 3. And that was fantastic. And then the Independent got snippy with me, as indeed they had got with Helen Fielding, who wrote Bridget Jones's Diary when her book did well. So then I thought, okay, fine, you know, I will I'll stop trying to get on with these people who are being snippy, and I will, you know, I'm a writer now. So I went off to be a writer.
Yeah.
And my second book, there's a market issue in the UK which has been altered by the advent of Amazon, but you know, it's still a market issue, which is that 50% at that point of books in the UK were actually sold via the supermarkets.
Okay, yeah.
So the supermarkets, you know, and they would only stock, you know, 20 titles or so a month. So you know, there was this real squeeze to get into the supermarkets, and people were doing everything to make their book, you know, appeal to them, and sort of forgetting about the wider world of readers. So anyway, my second book got designed to make I won't mention the name of the particular supermarket because they're extremely litigious, but it got designed to appeal to a particular book buyer at a particular supermarket, and she loved it, and they ordered 60,000 copies of this book. And so my publisher sort of went whoopee hurrah and let them have it as an exclusive for the supermarket, which is great, except that 6 weeks, no, less than that, yeah, about 6 weeks before the book came out, they got a new book buyer who took one look at the book and said, I hate that cover, and cancelled the order.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So they were able to cancel even though it was a contract.
Yeah, they had such a horrible grip over the books market that they were able to cancel the contract with.
And you couldn't just change the cover?
No, they said it was too late, didn't like it. They were going to have something else that they did like the jacket of.
So then you're screwed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember my then agent said, was telling me a story about how she was at a drinks party and she met the chief book buyer at WH Smith, which is a great big stationer's cum
Right.
bookstore in the UK. And she said, "Oh, what sort of books do you like?" And he said, "Oh, I really like Georgette Heyer." And my agent went, "Good Lord, that's very interesting. But you're a man. That's very interesting." He goes, "Yes, all that gold on the covers, it really stands out."
So all you need is the gold covers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I was pretty much stymied then, and the trouble is because of I'm sure you've encountered Nielsen's book scan, which gives the raw data on sales. So suddenly, because it had been an exclusive thing, they'd made no effort to sell it into the other shops, and therefore it pretty much wasn't stocked anywhere. So then I became, the bestseller who'd had a disaster with her second book.
And those 60,000 copies had already been printed at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was altogether a disaster. This has happened to other friends of mine. I mean, I know a number of careers were very badly damaged by 9/11 because nobody bought books in that month.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people who were doing well up to that point, who had books come out that month, suddenly were on Nielsen's book scanners having had a massive dip. And none of the buyers ever asked what the circs behind that were.
Yeah, I mean, but there's at least, I guess there's some kind of comfort knowing in your situation that it wasn't because the audience just didn't like the second book. The audience couldn't get the second book. So
yeah, absolutely.
Better than you not being appreciated.
Well, yes, except that ultimately the results were the same, because then
Right.
I was still under contract with Random House at that point for the third book, and they just lost interest. So I knew I was writing a third book, knowing that they weren't going to make any effort with it. And it was absolutely miserable. And then I wrote a fourth book, which got a print run of, God, I think about 500 or something, I mean, just, and I was desperately skinned. And it was really, really miserable. And it went on for a long time because I became very depressed with all of this as well, so there was a big gap between the books. And I was scrabbling around doing bits of editing to keep going. But, in the end, I was just, it was awful. It was dreadful. So anyway, I basically did a really stupid thing, which is I thought, I'm going to have one last go at this, and I need to change absolutely everything. And so
one last go means before you go find a full-time job.
Before I go find a job. Yeah, absolutely. So I parted company with my previous agent, who, really should have done more to make sure that the disaster with my second book hadn't just been put at my door by the time I got the third book there, and went out and found a new agent. And I knew at that point that I needed to change my name. So I was very surprised by how many agents were happy to see me, So anyway, I went in to see Letitia, my current agent, and she said, she'd asked me to give her a sort of roundup of my career thus far. So, I'd given her that before I came in, and she made me a cup of tea, and then she said, "So what do you think?" And I said, "I think I need to change my name." And she just said, "Yeah." And there was no flannel or I know it's difficult after all your achievements and all of that shit. It was just, yeah. And I knew that she was the person that I needed to be working with. And yeah, she was amazing. She is amazing.
And that's the nature of the business, right? Like I find one author who's been in it for 20 years or more who hasn't gone through extreme cycles.
Absolutely.
Your story, while that cycle was very extreme, is not completely unusual.
Absolutely.
And the idea, like, let me give this one last chance, and then after you change your name,
yes, and the doing the stupid thing was that I decided I was going to finance this on my credit card
at 18% interest rate.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So I did. So I financed the Wicked Girls on my credit card.
Wow.
Yeah, which was a really, really stupid thing to do. But
So
I had
so what does that mean though? You self-published? No, you didn't
no,
self-publish.
I just
Oh,
paid. I just paid for everything on my
oh, I
credit
see.
card.
You
18 months
sustained
it took me to.
your living without having to
Yeah,
get a job.
sustain
Right, right.
myself. Yeah,
Understood.
financed myself to write by
Wow.
using my credit card.
But
Taking
yeah,
taking cash downloads from my credit card. Things like that.
fortune
It's actually
favors the brave, right?
insane. Yeah.
So when you changed your name, had you at that point been writing psychological suspense at all, or was that kind of a pivot as well?
Well, my lost book, Hold My Hand, was a sort of mashup. I wanted to see if I could write in a different genre from the genre I'd been put in with the Temp, because obviously when Bridget Jones came out, everything being written by women was being published as chick lit, basically. So I then became a failed chick lit author. So anyway, I wanted to see if I could write in genre and but outside that genre. So Hold My Hand was a sort of mashup of psychological crime and a ghost story. It's a sort of dark old house in Cornwall on Bodmin Moor, where something has happened in the past, and a woman fleeing a violent marriage with her 6-year-old child comes to become caretaker there.
Oh.
And there's a ghost, and the child makes friends with this girl that doesn't seem to exist. And etc. And in the meantime, the violent husband is still pursuing them down. Yeah, I was very proud of it, actually. So it was really bloody miserable when it just vanished without trace.
Yeah.
But anyway, there we go. That again, I think one of the things that everybody needs to know in this life is that happens to some books.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can't get. My first 3 books didn't even sell, and then some have sold well, some have sold not so well. But you have to you have to love doing it, and you have to always be
exactly. You have to really, really be so desperate to do it that you will finance it by using your credit card.
Right. Well, and then on top of all of this, on top of all your productivity, you mentioned something while we were emailing that I found totally fascinating, is that you were recently diagnosed with ADHD.
Yes.
And then the irony of you having that and then being able to organize yourself to write novels, which you have to be highly organized to do, in my opinion. And attention to detail. So how did that all come about?
Yes, well, it's actually quite extraordinary, because I've gone from pretty much overnight gone from sort of beating myself up for being so unproductive and for being nearly 60 and having only written 8 books and generally, I mean, I have in fact 2 disabilities. I have ADHD, and I have a thing called hypermobility syndrome, which means that my joints pop out all the time. And my parents completely failed to notice either of these, but ascribed them to character flaws. And
both,
so
both
I was
since
very,
childhood.
very, absolutely, yeah. So that was my training. And I've spent my entire life beating myself up for being bad at doing the stuff that other people do, and I now overnight realize that I'm actually a bit of a fucking superhero.
Right. Well, yeah, you mentioned that to me, and I'm like, that's astounding. Because so how does that ADHD manifest itself in terms of you beating yourself up? Does that mean, I only wrote half an hour today and therefore I'm a failure?
No, I mean, okay, so ADHD is basically it's a brain processing problem.
Yeah.
And you have a shortage of norepinephrine, and you have a very low number of dopamine receptors in your brain. And how that manifests itself and that's actually one of the reasons why it took me so long to get diagnosed, is that it manifests very differently in boys and girls. So the classic ADHD thing that one thinks of is those Ritalin boys bouncing off walls,
right.
who obviously are much more disruptive in class, and therefore people notice them, you know. But actually, that girl who just phases out and stares out the window and can't focus on anything, that is what an ADHD girl looks like. So you have terrible difficulty focusing, and you're actually really tired all the time, and then you get these sort of bursts of overcompensatory energy which is where the sort of, you know, the bouncing off walls stuff comes from. But then, and that people see that, but they don't see you then, you know, going home and having to just go to bed. And with the whole focus thing, you know, I mean, I find public stuff quite difficult because I have quite profound prosopagnosia. I can't recognize people's names and faces, and that apparently is very common in ADHD people. So I find, you know, I all of those public space things I find extremely stressful, because I'm just terrified that I'm going to offend somebody at some point. You know, and in fact, yes, my publishers are now totally au fait with it. I got au fait with it long before my diagnosis. I was at the Harrogate Crime Festival, and this very nice man who looks a bit like Justin Trudeau came up and bussed me on both cheeks, and I thought, I know you, you know, and you're somebody that I feel well towards. So we were chatting, and I said, you know, look, darling, I call everybody darling. This is, but you know, which also then gets me into trouble, because people think that means that I know who the fuck they are. Anyway, eventually I said, look, darling, I'm so sorry. You know, I have prosopagnosia, or I completely forgotten what your name is. And he said, I'm David Shelley Serena. I'm your publisher.
Wow. Well, at least you can use the medical condition as I mean, that's a great condition.
Exactly.
Just
so
to
now I've got
anyway.
now I've got an excuse. Absolutely. I mean, I was whooping with delight when the shrink just, you know, said, you do realize that you have 7 out of the 9 diagnostic markers for ADHD.
So you get diagnosed in your 50s, and now they put you on medication. What's changed?
Well, I'm about halfway up. You have to, because basically what you take is speed. By the way, one of the reasons, also an interesting little sideline, cigarettes are absolute classic self-medication things, because what they actually do is stimulate your production of dopamine and norepinephrine. So my complete inability to give up smoking is also suddenly explained, you know. So I'm hoping that by the time I get up to the full dosage, I will lose interest in cigarettes. So it will be a nice, interesting thing to happen, you know. But yeah, so basically I'm on speed. I'm on slow release speed. And they've started me off on a low dose of it, and I'm about halfway through up to full dose now.
And you've seen changes?
I've totally seen changes. One of the really, really interesting changes is that I've been taking at least 1 painkiller a day, I think, since my late teens, and often a lot more. And you know, tend to, you know, a good day was a couple of ibuprofen, but it would go all the way up to diclofenac and to tramadol. You know, this has been all my adult life, and I suddenly realized after about 3 weeks that I hadn't taken a single painkiller in that time.
Wow.
And then I went and looked it up, and yeah, it's again, there's a real correlation between mysterious pain and ADHD, and pain sensitivity, and pain in the very specific places where I always get it, which is my shoulders, my back, my hips, and my knees. And then, you know, there was like just a list of the places where people with ADHD get pain, and that was me, you know. And it's just extraordinary. You keep finding these new things. 30% of ADHD people are hypermobile.
Wow. So listen, we're gonna do a very short storytelling,
Okay.
and this is the whole point of everything. So it's
Mhm.
it's all very easy. We're gonna pick a book, and then I'm gonna pick a sentence, and we're just gonna alternate, not necessarily just one sentence for one, but just a thought, a phrase, whatever comes to your mind.
Yeah, this is
But
absolutely terrifying.
I
Yeah.
know this is the best part of this. So I'm going to ask you to give me some numbers so I can pick a book. So pick a number between 1 and 3,
3,
1 and 7,
3,
1 and 20.
17,
Okay. And then 1 to 100
58,
and 1 to 3.
3.
Okay. This is all going to lead us to a sentence in a book from the bookshelves behind me. So I'm going to go and
Yes.
choose it. You picked my history section.
Hey.
So this is Stephen Ambrose's Citizen
Oh, how
Soldiers.
is that? Is it? Was it a good read?
It was a good read. I mean, this must have been 25 years ago that I read this. So nonfiction, obviously, but we can craft whatever story we want. Page 58, sentence 3. You ready? It's going to be easy. It's 2 words.
God.
Poor fool.
Right. So now I have to follow this with a sentence of some sort.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sentence, 2 sentences, whatever you want to do.
Yeah. She thought, he has no idea what comes next.
She poured 2 glasses of wine and walked over to him as he sat on the couch. He held that smirk on his face, that smirk that they always held when they thought that they knew what the next move was going to be.
We're both going in the same direction.
Oh, absolutely.
God, I'm not good at this. So when did you realize that you were a narcissist? She asked.
I've known it my whole life because people keep telling me how amazing I am. I assume you feel the same way about me. Otherwise, you wouldn't have invited me up here.
Well, I am your therapist, she said.
I hope you're okay with breaking some boundaries. You're not the first therapist I've been with.
No, she said, and sat next to him, hitching up her skirts.
She handed him a glass of wine, his glass of wine. He took it and took a sip, and then he grabbed her glass and set it on the table. I don't think we'll be needing these.
You're very confident, she said. What makes you believe that I'm not going to kill you?
He loved that question, and he had the perfect answer. He got about 3 words into that answer before his throat seized up.
You are very much more practiced than I am at this.
We can call it there. We know how this mystery ends. That was great. And so it's so interesting to see who I talk to and what direction the story goes, whether it goes supernatural or it goes straight to just the utter despair and darkness. So it's I'm waiting for my first erotic scene. So
first erotica, yes. Yeah. I bet everybody just realizes they're getting too close to erotica and immediately goes for the stabbing instead.
Right, yeah. The scene right there was almost both. So
yeah.
Well, listen, it was wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been great talking to you, my dear.
And I can't wait to meet you in real life. And if
absolutely.
you don't remember who my name is,
you're going to be going to BoucherCon or anything this year if we're allowed, if it happens?
If we're allowed.
Because I think it's meant to be New Orleans this year, isn't it?
Yep. And I'll have a name tag on so you won't have to remember my name.
I really, 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 really hope that I have found that I'm accessing a lot more of my vocabulary more quickly, and that I'm remembering more details.
That's wonderful.
And sort of able to remember what I was writing about yesterday when I go back to work. So I'm really hoping that that'll also turn into being able to remember who the hell anybody is.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
But
I'm
my
glad that's
goal
working out for you.
now, always send me an email before any of these events and says to tell me who's going to be there.
Excellent. Well, listen, have a lovely evening, and I can't wait to
You
meet you
too,
in
my dear.
person.
It's been great meeting you and great talking to you.
Thanks, Alex. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was Alex Marwood. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did too. You can find out more about her at alexmarwoodbooks.com. And if you want to know more about me, my books, my upcoming events, or subscribe to my irreverent and sardonic newsletter, you can visit me at carterwilson.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of Making It Up. See you again soon.